Thank you, Marnie. So tonight we're going to be, hopefully, as if things go according to plan, talking about Christianity and science. Not Christian Science. Christian Science is a strange religious movement started by Mary Baker Eddy, which is neither Christian nor science. But we're going to talk about how we as Christians can engage in a world that believes God is dead. As Nietzsche said, God is dead and we killed him. And there are those who would argue that science has disproved God. It certainly hasn't. But science is used as a club often with the assumption or the accusation that as Christians, we must be stupid and even anti-science, that we refuse to accept science and accept the evidence of science because we're just some superstitious group of unintelligent, uneducated people. The irony is that studies have shown that atheists tend to be more superstitious than religious people, but that's another thing altogether. But I want us to understand and to be able to have conversations where we can explain that we are not afraid of science. In fact, I firmly believe that science, pure science, and scientific evidence will always be on the side of Christians because God is real. And so because of that, true science will only ever show order in the universe, will show design in the universe, and will show that there's a creator who made everything. The challenge, of course, is, as we touched on when we looked at evolution and things like that, it is possible for two groups of people to look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions, because often we don't let the evidence speak for itself. We pick which evidence we look at, we interpret it different ways, and scientists are not immune from this. There's almost like this assumption that if somebody's a scientist, they are completely objective, they're not biased, and that is not true at all. If a scientist is atheist, he has a bias against any conclusion in a creator. If a scientist is has an agenda, he will bring that into his scientific studies often. And so I want us to show how we can engage people with these conversations around science. And perhaps the first thing to do is to say that despite many atheists claiming that they have the monopoly on reason and that science and Christianity are incompatible, actually some of the greatest scientists in history and even some of the greatest scientists today are Christians. And not only that, but many of the greatest scientists of history have actually been shaped and driven and motivated to their scientific discovery by the fact that they believe in a creator. And because they believe in a creator, they believe in a universe that has reason. And because a universe has reason, it's subject to scientific principles. So, for example, Copernicus was a devout Christian, and he was one of the earliest scientists to argue that the Earth went around the sun, not that everything revolved around the Earth. By the way, if anybody ever claims that Christians campaigned and believed in a flat Earth, that is not true. It was generally accepted by everybody. About 300 years before Jesus even lived, it was proved that the Earth was round with a very simple experiment with two sticks. The whole debate around a flat Earth has never been a serious debate amongst scientists, amongst Christians, amongst the church. But Copernicus was an early Christian. He was driven by his belief in a creator. It might surprise you to know that Charles Darwin, although I would struggle to call him a Christian as such, explicitly denied being an atheist. He wrote a poem mocking atheism and repeatedly used the word creator in his writings. He believed that you could believe in a creator and evolution. Galileo was a devout Christian, and Galileo is one of those stories that atheists love to use to mock Christians with. They say, yes, Galileo was persecuted by the church. And to some degree he was persecuted by the Catholic Church because he was teaching that the solar system, the sun was the center of the solar system. But it was beyond that, it was other things as well. But interestingly, if you know the story, it wasn't the church fighting against scientists. It was all the other scientists using the church to fight against Galileo because he was trying to prove them wrong. So there was a scientific consensus where most scientists of his day disagreed with Galileo and they tried to silence him by using the church. And so that's not very different to today, where we have certain consensuses of scientists who are trying to silence any dissenters using different things. But Galileo, despite being attacked by the Pope and by the Catholic Church at times, remained a devout Christian. And he said this: God is known by nature in his works and by doctrine in his revealed world, in his revealed word. And he says the Bible teaches men how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. And so there you've got Galileo, who's used as some kind of hero of atheism to browbeat Christians with, and he was a devout Christian and believer. Isaac Newton was a very devout man who wrote probably as many theological books as he did scientific books. And he said this: gravity explains the motion of the planets, but it cannot explain who set the planets in motion. God governs all things and knows all that is or can be done. Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, was a Christian. Louis Pasteur, who for whom we get the term pasteurization from, was the father of microbiology. And it's interesting that it was Pasteur who disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. In other words, before Pasteur, most scientists believed that certain organisms just spontaneously came to be out of nothing. So they didn't understand, for example, microorganisms and all of that, that milk could go off and sour and then mold, and then, you know, where did flies come from and all of that kind of thing. You know, maggots just appeared from nowhere. So the scientists of his day believed that life could just spontaneously come out of nothing. He disproved that. And here we are hundreds of years later, with many scientists still trying to argue to us today that all of life initially came out of nothing. This is what it was said of Pasteur. He had absolute faith in God and in eternity, and a conviction that the power for good is given to us in this world and will be continued beyond it. Those were feelings which pervaded his whole life, and he was a strong believer in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Another famous scientist, George Washington Carver, often testified that his Christian faith was the only mechanism by which he could effectively pursue science. He provided everything that people needed, but it was up to us as humans to discover the secrets. Sorry, somebody was trying to call me. Up to humans to discover the secrets and the hidden uses of every plant, animal, and mineral. Not only was he arguing that science was compatible with his belief, he said science is driven by his belief. Many scientists today are devout followers of Jesus Christ or theists of some kind. The inventor of the CAT scan, one of the masters behind, or one of the great geniuses behind DNA and all of these things, the Christians. But what you will find increasingly is Christians and Christian viewpoints are being silenced in our universities, in our research stations, in books, and in the media. If a man who is a scientist today publicly declares that he does not believe in evolution, for example, it is highly likely that he will be run out of his position. And so it's increasingly difficult for Christians to speak out. It's also true that as well as some being afraid to speak, some being silenced, and some being sidelined, the very process of going through scientific study is a process of indoctrination. And if you're not willing to toe the line, there is no way you will ever receive your scientific credentials. Be in no doubt, there is censorship in the scientific community today, and we'll look at that a little bit later, including in recent news. There's a man, and I'll touch on this again with the details. There's a man who wanted to study what is entitled transgender regret. In other words, people who've undergone transgender surgery and then regretted that and wanted to change back. So he wanted to do a study on that. What is the percentage of those people? What did they go through? And he was forbidden by his university from doing that. Not because it was a non-scientific study, but the university was so afraid of the social media backlash. And so even certain areas of study are denied to people because they don't fit the prevailing popular narratives. Somebody said this: censorship of science is deeply troubling on many levels. At the most basic, it affronts the fundamental premise of the scientific method. Science isn't static. It constantly questions, borrows from, builds on, and adds to existing knowledge. Its basic tools include formulating and testing hypotheses, documentation and replication of results, peer review and publication. For science to advance, knowledge must be shared. Without the free exchange of ideas, science as we understand it cannot exist and progress. The purpose of science is to produce knowledge. If science is corrupted, what flows from it is not knowledge, but something else: misinformation, propaganda, and partial truths. Let me say that again. They say if there is censorship in science, what we get is not science, but misinformation, propaganda, and partial truths. That was written by by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, who are themselves hyper-partisan, hyper-leftist. But isn't it that true that if we're going to censor what people can study, what people can publish, what methodology they can use, how they can test hypotheses, it's no longer science. It is propaganda in the name of science. And what we're finding increasingly is that whilst true science can be relied upon, we've developed this religion of scientism, where we worship scientific output and we bow the knee to these things. And so we're not bowing the knee to truth, we're bowing the knee to misinformation and propaganda. I've got the details of the transgender regret study. The guy's name who wanted to study is a name called James Caspian. And it was Bath University that denied permission for him to study that. He'd already enrolled, he'd already been agreed certain things. And then when they found this out, they denied permission for him to do the study. And this isn't a Christian guy. This isn't an anti-trans guy. This isn't a guy with an agenda. This was a guy who had actually been part of counseling people into transition. So he was a supporter of the transgender movement, and yet he was vilified and denied the opportunity to study transgender regret. Indoctrination, censorship, and persecution are making it increasingly difficult for any scientist, particularly people of faith, to enter into and to succeed in the scientific arena. And what happens, therefore, is you create echo chambers. Echo chambers is a term, we find them on social media. So the way social media works, for example, is Facebook will figure out which content you read and which content you like and deliver more of that kind of content to you. So if you're a conservative, you'll get more and more conservative material sent to you. If you're a leftist, you get more and more leftist material. And so what happens is you end up only reading and interacting with people who agree with you. Your viewpoint is never challenged. And so your viewpoint is just echoing around and getting louder and louder and louder. And that is not good for science, and it's not good for society. When scientists get caught in an echo chamber where the hypotheses, the presumptions, and what they believe is never tested, we no longer have science. The whole purpose of science is to challenge the presumed narrative of what we believe currently. And so what you find interesting, because of these echo chambers, because of censorship, because of propaganda, you find the scientific community in some areas have become absolutely unscientific. So we now have scientists who are arguing that there is no intrinsic difference between male and female, whereas the evidence is overwhelming that there are physical, chemical, hormonal, emotional differences that are distinctly different between male and female. We find a scientific community that will not argue that life starts at conception, even though it's a scientifically established fact that life begins at conception. Because to argue those points, the distinction between male and female would go against the transgender kind of sexual identity, sexual politics of the age. And to argue that life starts at conception goes against the theory of abortion. And so many scientists have been co-opted by leftist and liberal and atheistic worldviews rather than being purely scientific in their approach. And so that's why I say I will trust science, but not necessarily scientists. Science is correct. Scientists are often wrong. Similarly, in Christianity, I trust the Bible. The Bible is true. What people teach about the Bible isn't always true. Yeah, just because somebody teaches something doesn't mean it's true. But if Marnie was to start teaching some strange doctrine, it wouldn't cause me to say I'm anti-Bible. I'm anti a misuse of the Bible. So I'm not anti-science. I'm anti a misuse of science or an abuse of science. And so one of the things people love to throw out in arguments, and in fact, I did it earlier, and I wanted to see if you'd catch this. People love to reinforce their arguments by saying, studies show, science has proven. And when people say studies show, it's always a good idea to say, which studies? Because even if there are studies that allegedly show certain things, it's a good idea to check what those studies are and how they've come about, who's published them, and so forth. 1 second, I realize I'm looking a bit ominous. I'm just going to throw a bit more light in the room. Is that better? You can see me more clearly, so it probably isn't better.
Now I can actually see you. I was wondering if you were there.
Okay, so let's have a look at science and some of the steps and some of the problems that currently exist around science. So the first thing we've got to talk about is, for a result to be true, we have to have followed the scientific method. Now, this is a big subject in itself, and I don't want to spend an hour on this, but basically, the scientific method says you have an observation, it makes you question, so you have a hypothesis, then you conduct experiments, you get a result, and then you reach a conclusion. So Isaac Newton was sat under a tree, an apple fell down, he went, oh, that apple just fell down. Why? Maybe there's a force that's causing it to fall. Let me conduct some experiments. He looked at the results, and his conclusion were his laws of motion. And that is a process that was observable and repeatable. So even high school students now can do experiments where they can observe the same forces at work and they get exactly the same results. And because the same results happen every time, you can say, yes, there is a law, there is a scientifically established fact. If we did experiments and apples only fell out of trees 50% of the time, we'd have to say our conclusion is false and we'd have to go back. The weaknesses of this often lie in each study. Our observation is twisted, especially with social sciences, when we're talking about human beings. We often ask questions that are loaded or incomplete, have a hypothesis that excludes God or has an agenda. We conduct faulty experiments and pick the results and come to faulty conclusions. So an example of this, which I was reading recently, researchers found that eating nuts is healthy and can lower incidence of heart attack, but eating peanut butter doesn't have the same effect. So why is it that peanuts are healthy, but peanut butter isn't? Now, the problem with that is when they did the experiment, they had two groups of people, one who ate nuts and one who ate peanut butter. The reality is somebody who's likely to eat nuts regularly is likely to have a pretty healthy diet overall, whereas somebody who eats peanut butter probably doesn't have a much healthier diet. So unless you can add into that observation a whole bunch of variables and say they've got exactly the same diet other than nuts and peanut butter, the conclusion is entirely faulty because the effects are from other things. Another research showed that people who brush their teeth more often have lower rates of heart disease. So does that mean that brushing your teeth protects your heart? No, it simply means people who brush their teeth regularly are more likely to look after themselves generally. If you're not even going to brush your teeth, you probably don't look after yourself at all. It's not brushing your teeth that protects your heart, it's all the other variables. So can you see how, particularly in social sciences, you can do an observation, but unless you've got a correct scientific method, the conclusion that you can draw has nothing to, it can be completely inaccurate. But for science to prove something, we need a scientific method. And that's why we have a problem with something like evolution. Evolution, somebody had an observation, they had a question, and they had an hypothesis. But there's no experiment that they've conducted. It's not observable and repeatable. And so you're left with a hypothesis, and you can look at lots of evidence and say, oh, the evidence supports my hypothesis, but the evidence doesn't prove the hypothesis. And that is actually where we need to challenge people, that a lot of scientists would like to say that evolution has been proven. It hasn't been proven. It's simply a bunch of evidence has been collected selectively that seems to support that suggestion, but it only supports that suggestion if you look at the evidence already believing in your hypothesis. Which means if you're looking for a particular thing, you will exclude other things. This is something called confirmation bias, where if you believe something, you will look for evidence to reinforce your belief, and you'll ignore evidence that is contrary to it. Police departments fall victim to this all the time. If they have a suspect in a case, that they often just zoom in on evidence that supports this person being guilty and ignore everything else. But true scientists need to look at all of the evidence and come to a conclusion. So often when you look at a study, it is worth looking at the method used, the methodologies used, look at what the results were and see if the results and the conclusions match, and often they don't. Another thing we need to look at with scientists is the link between science and money. There is a correlation between who is funding an experiment and the result that that experiment comes to. Now, you will be told if you question this, that scientists have to declare conflicts of interest. They have to put in their studies who's financing it and why they're doing the research. But whilst that is normally required, it is often not enforced. A non-disclosure is a common occurrence, according to scientists themselves, that often scientists will hide or publishers will hide who is financing a particular study. A famous case of this is, and it has massive ramifications, is in the 70s we began to hear that fat causes heart attacks. And so fat was removed from food. And because fat was removed from food and we all started getting low-fat foods, in order for food to maintain flavor, because often the flavor is in fats, sugars were added. And it's discovered that the sugar industry was, at least in part, financing these studies because they wanted to sell more sugar. These are just simple, well-known things in the scientific world where it's come out that studies have had certain results, not based on truth, but have been interpreted by the paymasters. We also have sensationalism and hubris. Hubris, where people make a bigger deal of something than it actually is. And the reality is, if you're a PhD and you want to be a professor, you want funding for your research, you want to be successful, you want career advancement, you need to be published and you need to be noticed. Now, here's a scary thought. Between 2005 and 2009, more than 100,000 students received a PhD in the US alone. 100,000 people in 4 years got a PhD. In the same period, only 16,000 university jobs became available. So you've got these people who spent in the US hundreds of thousands of dollars in gaining a PhD and now need a career path. And they found there's way too many PhDs for the career paths. So how do you succeed in your career? You've got to come up with a sensational, groundbreaking, newsworthy scientific breakthrough. And also what we find is this, that the model for universities is universities themselves rely on funding and donations, which they attract by their PhDs themselves having scientific breakthroughs. So if universities don't conduct experiments with new knowledge, they won't get new funding. And what happens is you've got so many people specializing. What we have now is more and more people studying more and more about narrower and narrower subjects. Somebody said it like this: we're studying more and more about less and less until we know everything about nothing. And that is the current scenario for PhDs. It is a cutthroat business, and researchers are under tremendous pressure to create something that will make the news. In fact, it's been calculated that over 90% of all the scientists who've ever lived are alive today, competing for the same number of column inches in our newspapers and the various publications. And so what you find is scientists themselves make inflated claims about their research, and then many newspapers are happy to inflate those claims in sensational headlines, because newspapers love to, they need to attract people's attention, they need to attract controversy, they need to grab the attention. So a classic example a couple of years ago was a newspaper headline that says, "Spanking makes kids stupid." That was the headline. Studies have shown that, now when you read it, it's a very faulty study that suggests maybe that those kids who've been beaten as children have poorer outcomes academically than those who don't. Now, most of us would say, well, kids who are beaten would probably come from homes where they get less parental help with homework, less drive, less motivation, and so and more difficult circumstances, maybe where there's domestic abuse of the parents. So there's 101 factors why they would have a lower academic result. The conclusion, spanking makes kids stupid, is not a conclusion you could draw from the study. And also the study itself was flawed in major ways, which we'll come to later. But that's the newspaper headline. And most people don't go by the headline. So they don't read, and they don't read the details critically. We need to be those who can critique the substance of some of these claims. There's also scientists are prejudiced, and that can determine what is studied, how it's studied, and how the results are viewed. So let's take, we've been mentioning spanking, so let's talk about spanking. You'll often hear many studies have proved that spanking is bad for kids. Okay, well, let's have a look at the studies, because actually the studies that really hone in and look at loving relationships, mild forms of corporal punishment that are used in conjunction with other forms of punishment actually have positive results. But most studies, for example, would just say all corporal punishment is abuse, so they will never differentiate between a light tap on the bum and a punch in the face. And so everybody, I think every sane human being on the planet would say punching a kid in the face will have adverse effects. But if you cannot differentiate between a small tap on the bum and a punch in the face, then the results that you're going to get are results for abuse, not for spanking by a loving parent in a safe environment. But many of these studies are done by activists and financed by activists, and the very purpose is to come to a conclusion, not to let the conclusions speak for themselves. Another issue that we need to understand is that pretty much all of the studies, especially on something like spanking, are not what's called longitudinal studies, in other words, following people over time. And so all they can show is correlation, not causation. Let me explain that for those who don't understand. Correlation means that corporal punishment and violence in adults seems the more somebody is the more somebody experiences corporal punishment as a child, the more likely they are to be a violent adult. That is correlation. What they often do is take it to the next step and say, therefore, we can see that spanking has caused violence. No, not necessarily, because the biggest predictor of violence in adults is violence in childhood. So those who are going to grow up more violent as adults are highly likely to have been more violent as children. Who's going to receive more corporal punishment? A non-violent or a violent child? So it's not that the spanking has caused the violence, is that there's a correlation. It's like saying people who use more sunscreen are more likely to get cancer. Now, does that mean the sunscreen has caused cancer, or does it mean those who use a lot of sunscreen are those who are in the sun a lot? Correlation and causation are two separate things, and we've got to be careful of those things. Another example of this as well, where we can, and this is just showing how the scientific method is wrong and everything else. There was an experiment, and I've just checked it tonight to see if this has been taken offline. And the research itself has been debunked, but a lot of the newspaper articles about it are still online. So you can read online. If you Google it, it says that research and a study has shown that children with a religious upbringing are less generous and less altruistic than those with an atheist upbringing, okay? Now, that's quite a shocking study to say that religion actually produces meaner adults, less generous, less empathetic adults. Now, there are a number of problems. One was in the way the study was conducted. But after the study was published, after it was reported on, other people looked at the study, and do you know what they found? They found that the atheist activist scientists who conducted the study actually completely misinterpreted the results. And the results actually showed the opposite of what they claimed, and showed that children with a religious upbringing were actually more generous and more altruistic. The main driver of difference between how empathetic somebody grew up was the culture they lived in, not the religion that they had. But you still, And on a internet forum on Facebook or whatever, you will still see people quoting that and saying, a study proved religion is bad for kids. It's been completely debunked, but the newspaper articles are still online. So we need also to be quite critical and really look at what the newspapers are saying, what the online, what a Google search will reveal, and see how reliable it really is. Another problem we have with modern science is the idea of consensus. So global warming, and I don't want to get into global warming, but one of the things that's thrown around as an argument why we need to react drastically to global warming is 95% of scientists agree that global warming is damaging the planet. Okay, so that seems to end discussion. 95% of scientists agree. Well, the first thing is science never, ever works on consensus. Science works by questioning the consensus. If we always worked on consensus, there would be no scientific advancement. With the advent of the first steam trains, scientists believed that if a train ever traveled over 30 kilometers an hour, its passengers would asphyxiate. So we would never have had trains going above 30 kilometers an hour if we'd stuck to the scientific consensus. Science is about testing the consensus and working against it. Secondly, what does 95% of all scientists mean? If I'm a psychologist, I can call myself a scientist, but what do I know about climate? So the fact that it's 95% of all scientists, what does that mean? And thirdly, while 95% of scientists may or may not agree with this concept of global warming, do they all agree on the exact causes, the severity, the degree? No. And so there is a lot of disagreement within the details. So be very cautious of broad statements like that, because often they're brought to shut people up and stifle debate. And when you dig a little deeper, you find it's not quite as persuasive as people think. And then I want to give you some information that might shock you. And it's on the whole peer review system. So basically what happens in science is a scientist does an experiment, he collects the results, he publishes a paper or submits a paper for publishing. And the scientific journal, before it publishes it, will send it to several other scientists in the same field and say, will you review this and tell us that it's reliable? And those peers come back and go, yeah, it's good. And then it gets published. So the thinking is, and the general approach is, if it's a published paper that has been peer reviewed, it's trustworthy. Oh, if that was so. Somebody once said, if peer review was a drug, it would never get on the market because it is so unreliable. This is what people say, and this is scientists who are not got a Christian agenda. Hundreds of thousands of papers are published each year in the medical, this is in medical literature. So this is pretty hard science. Medical literature, where you've done double-blind drug tests with placebos, the whole tests that our vaccinations have gone through. This is hard science. So if the unreliability of this stuff is true, then the unreliability of social science experiments is exponentially worse. But anyway, so hundreds of thousands of papers are published each year in the medical literature, and each year the number of papers published continues to grow. Publication in a peer-reviewed journal is a core requirement for advancement in one's career as a scientist. But it's also widely recognized that a large proportion of what gets published is either wrong or meaningless. Think about that. A large proportion of what is published as a peer-reviewed article is either wrong or meaningless. It's been calculated that around 30% of all peer-reviewed articles that are published have results that people cannot replicate. In other words, results that are wrong. 30%. So how much do you want to put your faith in scientists? That's 30% in general. For social sciences, the rate is probably over 50%. In other words, published articles of social sciences are probably wrong more often than they're right. But most of the general public doesn't know that. They don't know how the system works. They just assume that if a highly educated scientist says that's correct, it must be correct. There was an experiment conducted in the British Medical Journal. This is not some obscure art journal. This is a mainstream, one of the most creditable journals in the world, the British Medical Journal. And a short paper containing 8 deliberate errors was sent to 300 reviewers. So they did this experiment and said, we're going to send out an article. We're going to put 8 deliberate errors in it. We'll send it to 300 people for peer review and see how many of the 8 errors are spotted. No one out of the 300 found more than 5. On average, they found 2 errors, and 20% of people didn't find any errors. So what does that tell you? In one article, 300 reviewers, most failed to spot deliberate and glaring errors in the article. This itself has massive, massive repercussions. You know, the British Medical Journal published a peer-reviewed article in 1998, and I don't want to get into vaccination conspiracy theories, but a man called Andrew Wakefield alleged that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine caused leaky intestines and autism in children. Now, there's still some argument in some circles about whether it does. But the article that was published was research done on only 12 cases. Only 12. So how you can get a result by only looking at 12 people. And it was reviewed by 6 reviewers, and they all failed to spot many of the concerns, including the fact that Wakefield himself was being paid by certain interests to come up with a certain result. That has had massive, massive repercussions in the world. And this is a mainstream, highly respected journal. So when people say there's a published article that proves, well, I think we can afford to be a little skeptical. That isn't to say we must be science deniers, but we must check and double check the science. In fact, here's one of my favorite stories. There were 3 scientists. You can go and do your research. You read about these guys because it's hilarious. Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay, and Peter Boghossian. They wrote a bunch of papers under fake names. They wrote 20 papers. And their challenge was, how can we produce ridiculous papers that have nothing to do with reality? We'll just put the latest buzzwords in that are, you know, especially, you know, things around gender and identity and feminism. And we'll just put enough buzzwords in and see how many of them get published. All of them were rubbish. None of them were real studies. None of them were real science. They submitted 20 papers. 7 were accepted for publication, and 5 were under review to be published. And all of them were nonsense. Just to tell you how nonsense they were, one was said to be a scientific report on why heterosexual men in America like to visit the restaurant Hooters, where the waitresses wear tight t-shirts. Another paper was on rape culture and dog parks. Because when you go to a dog park and one dog tries to have sex with another dog, that shows us where rape culture comes from. And a third paper took Hitler's book Mein Kampf, and all it did is change some of the words. So it was, instead of Hitler's struggle, it was the feminist struggle. And that was published as a serious work on feminism. And this is what they said. These are scientists, and they're not Christians. They're just people who are concerned about the scientific community. They said this: something has gone wrong in the universities, especially in certain fields within the humanities. They said scholarship is based less upon finding truth and more upon attending to social grievances, and it's become fairly established, if not fully dominant, within these fields. And very often as Christians, it's the social sciences and the humanities that we're pitted against. Studies around homosexuality, about sexual identity, around the patriarchy, about feminism, about critical race theory, all of these things which are junk, but they're not challenged because our universities have become so infiltrated and so dominated and so taken over. And scholarship is less about finding truth now, and it's more about supporting what is ultimately a Marxist agenda and a Marxist story. You know, a lot of what is taught in universities today, and we need to prepare our teenagers for this. When Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto, he talked about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and how it was a class war. And all that happened is some guys got hold of that and they said there is a war, but it's not between classes, it's between different identities and races. And so they created different, what are called intersectionalities. What is your race? What is your gender? What is your sexual preference? And so it's still the politics of grievance. It's Marxism reworked into a social narrative. And that is the overwhelming narrative in colleges and universities today. And that is what is thrown at the population as science. And as we've seen, it's anything but scientific. So I want to say to you, if you're in a discussion with somebody and they start trying to play the science card, if they start saying studies have shown, ask them which studies. 99% of people say, oh, I don't know. I just heard studies show. Well, that's meaningless. What if I say studies show that the moon is made of green cheese? You can't argue with that. I've just made it up, study. So ask which studies. Then check the studies. Who conducted that study and why? What was their agenda? Who was paying them? Think about the whole concept. You know, often when you read the details of a scientific publication, so I mentioned this when we looked at evolution. Many of you have heard of Lucy, this skeleton or this skull that was discovered, which was purported at the time to be something of a missing link between apes and humans. And they said, look, there's evidence that Lucy walked upright and all of these things. The conclusion that this Lucy creature walked upright was taken from the fact that a leg bone was discovered and a foot bone 1,000 kilometers away from the skull. I don't know about you, but if I find a skull in one place and a leg bone 1,000 kilometers away, I would not assume that they belong to the same skeleton. But that was the trick that they pulled or tried to pull with that. And over time, the thesis and their evidence has fallen apart. But look at what is the information, what was the evidence they collected, and see if that fits in with the conclusion that they came to. Also read, particularly when it comes to things like geology, evolution, and things like that. Papers will be written with a very dogmatic headline. This shows this or this. But then when you read the content, it'll often say, we believe, it is likely that. That kind of language. Now, if I write a paper with I believe in it a lot, it's because I'm talking about faith. Many of these papers that are called scientific are actually faith-based papers because the people saying, we believe this and there is evidence that this and maybe this, or our best guess, or it is likely. That isn't scientific proof. That is evidence that people are trying to fit into a particular worldview. Ask, has the conclusion been challenged and who by? What was the methodology that they used? Because to be honest, you and I, most of us are not scientists, but when I read particularly social science studies and read about what methods they used to come to their conclusions, I immediately go, that's lost all credibility for me. So again, coming back to spanking, There was one research that was done about corporal punishment, but what they did, they only looked at children who were considered at risk, people from abusive homes. Now, if you're going to isolate people and say we're only going to study children in abusive homes where there's been domestic abuse, where a father's beaten a mother, I can tell you right now, there's going to be, whether they've received corporal punishment or not, because they're from at-risk homes, they will have negative outcomes. So the methodology straight away said, don't come and tell me that's a credible paper on corporal punishment. You know, when we talk about things like critical race theory in America, and one of the things people say is the systemic racism in America because Black children do worse at school than white children. And again, is there racism in America? Yes. Is there a legacy of, you know, past policies? Yes. But actually, if you drill into the details, you know, the number one factor in whether a child succeeds or fails in school, stays out of prison, doesn't get involved in teenage pregnancy or drugs or crime or all of these things, the number one indicator is not race, it's whether a father is present in the house. That's the number one indicator for success. But there's a narrative where in America, where we've got to destroy the patriarchy, we can't for a second concede that fathers are important. And so we've got to ignore that and actually come up with another reason. And what you find is, particularly in America, because of government policy has incentivized people, men not to stay in the home. They've incentivized absentee fathers by providing extra funds for single moms. And so you see in America that the fatherless rate, particularly in the Black community, has skyrocketed over the last 50, 60 years. And with that skyrocketing of father absence has come a skyrocketing of prison population, crime, Black on Black violence and stuff. So is there racism? Yes. Is systematic racism the reason for this? It might be a factor, but father absence is a bigger factor. And so we've got to be able to look at things and be well informed enough, not just to take the narrative where people say, scientists say. Because to be honest with you, a lot of what scientists say today is neither true nor scientific. Be careful, we don't want to come across and say we are ignoring science. But I think we're allowed to critique science and say we want to at least base our discussion on true scientific results, using true scientific methodology that is credible, not on papers where, as I say, maybe there's up to a 50% rate of published articles that have proven to be false. And so a little bit of reading, a little bit of common sense, and a little bit of understanding how the scientific world works can go a long way in our discussions to give credibility to what we're saying. And again, this thing won't get anybody saved, but it will give us credibility that when we state our case and we state the truths that we believe in, we don't come across as stupid, science-denying, superstitious idiots, but we come across as reasonable people who can give a reason for the hope that we have. And tonight's session probably won't give you enough of that, but if it is something that interests you and has whetted your appetite, it is something that you can read more on and prepare yourself more with in the coming days and weeks. And with that, I'll hand over back to Marnie, and I'm sure there will be, but we'll see if there's any questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. I'm sure a few of your heads are spinning and you've got 110 questions. Either place them in the comments box, or if you in touch with Lindsay, you can WhatsApp it to Lindsay, or if you want to ask them on the screen, you are welcome. I don't know who wants to go first, because I do realize that there would probably be be many questions. I think, Mike, a few weeks ago, I preached on psychology and its role in the church. So I want to invite you to go and listen to that message as well. It speaks into some of the stuff that Mike mentioned about science, and the so-called studies have shown, especially in the psychology field. So you can go and listen to that as well. Any questions, guys? I know there's going to be questions. We're just waiting for the first one to go.
I'll go if nobody else is coming in. Mike, you've talked a lot about the problems in the universities, and I think that's really pertinent and helpful. And I think it's clear universities under a lot of financial pressure, funding problems in universities, and I think that you've highlighted some issues that can really corrupt the pursuit of knowledge. I suppose two questions really. One is what as Christians what should be our reaction as Christians to the pursuit of knowledge in general. Adam and Eve took from the tree of knowledge, and that's an interesting concept in itself. But and specifically, Marnie knows I have teenage children who will soon be going to universities in Europe. They've got a good Christian foundation. They do have an interest in science, in the pursuit of science and social sciences. And what would your specific, and you talked about guarding our teenagers in that context, and what would be advice to our teenagers in that context? And how should they go into the pursuit of knowledge in universities as they are now?
So for me, the pursuit of knowledge is a good thing. You know, God has created us with minds and with an intellect. You know, and the whole Adam and Eve thing was about setting your human wisdom above God's wisdom. And you know, we can't exalt our own thinking above God's thinking, but God's thinking is truth. So study is a good thing, as long as our hearts remain humble and we don't try and exalt ourselves above God. And that is the problem with man. Man exalts himself above God and puts himself in place of God. But knowledge can only be good because true knowledge can only glorify God more. The challenge, I think, and one of our concerns is, you know, even teenagers that are brought up in good Christian households and well-churched and well-versed in the Bible, when they hit university, it is a complete onslaught. And often they're not equipped to handle why they're being bombarded with such things. You know, whether it be social justice, Black Lives Matter, intersectionality, all of these things. And I do think we need to prepare our teenagers for how the enemy works, how these worldviews come at us, how they undermine the truth, and let them know what they're going to face, and then and really encourage them, probably more than encourage, almost force them to get linked into a good church and a good set of people around them that can help hold them strong wherever they go. Now, many years ago, I was involved in youth ministry for a long time, and I spent a lot of time talking about resisting peer pressure. And as I've got older, I realized I made a mistake, that yes, we need to resist peer pressure, but very few people are ever able to resist peer pressure. And in fact, the Bible doesn't say resist peer pressure. The Bible says bad company corrupts good character. So it's not about resisting peer pressure. It's about surrounding yourself with the right peers who will help to lead you in truth. And unfortunately, what happens for many of our young people is they go off to university and they're surrounded not just by lecturers, but by fellow students and everything else, all who are just swallowing this anti-God worldview, and to stand against that is incredibly difficult, particularly if you don't have people around you to support you. So I think those are things. Prepare the guys beforehand for what they're going to face, how the world works, how the worldviews shape arguments, and then how are you going to be linked to people who are going to help you and anchor you to the truth. And those are the key things. But not to be afraid of truth and not to be afraid of knowledge. You know, we can all find scriptures, you know, knowledge puffs up, but there are also scriptures that commend us for knowledge, and for lack of knowledge and for lack of wisdom, you know, the young people are full of zeal, but for lack of knowledge, they take the wrong way. So knowledge is a good thing if it's submitted to a humble heart and a heart that's looking for God.
Yeah, it's good.
And I want to say this week, whilst in one sense I'm very afraid of sending my children off to university. In one sense, I'm petrified of it. In one sense, we're not called to be people who live in fear, and we actually need people of faith to rise up in these institutions and be a voice. We need Christians in the sciences, and in order for Christians to succeed in the sciences, they're going to have to run a gauntlet of persecution and ridicule and all of those things. But unless we've got brave people who do it, then we've lost before we start in that realm of society.
The question was asked, how can we prepare our teens? And is it totally possible to prepare them? And I want to just say a little thing, and then Mike can obviously add bits as well. I absolutely am 100% sure and confident that we can prepare our teens. I think historically Christians have sometimes buried their head in the sand and not engaged and finding out for themselves the meaning of words, the meaning of these concepts, and dived into intellectual conversation. And that has led many in the past to actually go and search information and concern stuff for themselves. And much of it had to do with us being duped into somehow believing that we're not smart enough and somehow we're losing. And I think there are, and Ilka asked early on, or somebody asked early on about where can we find stuff for science? And Mike mentioned it last week. Answers in Genesis is an excellent site. It is probably the most well-known. It's been around for, I think, 20 years plus. Well-researched, based on science, also excellent materials for kids. And I also want to say that if it's important enough for you, if you engage in conversation and teaching yourself these things, you will be surprised. It's a few months ago that I realized that my apologetic skills are not up to date. And I've intentionally started to inform myself, to study, to get to know. And it's interesting in a short period of time how much I was able to pick up, because we're not talking about thousands of different concepts here. It's things that are interrelated, one thing connected to the other, that leads to the other, and it's use of clever words, but it's very similar in similar ways. So I want to encourage everybody that it is very possible for you to educate yourself, bring your kids alongside, and Mike said, in the context of a local church. And if your local church is willing to invest in this and prioritize this and engage the kids, there's nothing that will beat that. I mean, I don't know if there's something that Mike will want to add to what I've said.
Yeah, just to plug some of our resources in this. In our T3 Bible College course, which is a 2-year quite intensive course, and it is available on our Right Now Media thing, which I think, Marnie, you've got access to.
But I have the hard drive. I have it with me as well.
Oh, you've got it on hard drive.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't go through all 8 sections of it, but in the one section, I got Adam Hellier, who's very well versed in apologetics. It's his thing, and does quite an extensive thing on worldviews and the history of worldviews, the Enlightenment, evolution. And so that can be one resource for you and your teenage children to listen to. It's very well researched and often talks, for example, about how our worldview can be shaped in very subtle ways. So just as a highlight, one of the things he talks about is the sitcom Friends. Now, how many of you have been fans of the sitcom Friends? And you know, it seems quite harmless, kind of fun comedy. And he just said, here's some statistics. This is how many individuals each of those people has sexual relationships with over a 10-year period. And the figures are absolutely mind-blowing. And he says, and what happens is we are manipulated into cheering for them and celebrating this lifestyle of sexual depravity. And without, and our culture, you know, at church, we know it's wrong. And then we sit in front of TV and we celebrate it. Now, I'm not saying you can't watch Friends necessarily. That's your conscience. But Adam is very good at unpicking some of the things, how social media influences us. If you haven't already done it, I would highly recommend you get your teenagers to watch, if you've got access to Netflix, the documentary, The Social Dilemma, which is a very, very scary documentary, but will tell you how social networks and social media are basically leading us to destruction. And that's from a non-Christian perspective, and it's still incredibly scary. So those are resources, as well as things like Answers in Genesis. Francis Schaeffer, How Then Shall We Now Live, is it's a book and a video series, incredibly insightful and in many ways prophetic, dealing with philosophy, art, and culture. And he died several years ago, and he predicted where we would be today, because he just could see how philosophy and culture and academics works together. So C.S. Lewis on philosophy and religion, there's many, many good, reliable things out there if we're willing to look.
Excellent. You guys can contact me if you want, if we can find a way to give you access to the T3 material. It's absolutely brilliant. Mike speaks on various topics that are so relevant today, like the end times, for instance. He's got, I think session 8. It's all about the end times. And so, yeah. Anyone else? Remark, comment, question? Sorry,
Mike, can I ask something? I think you said at the beginning that that it's scientifically proven that life begins at conception. Now,
yes.
Now I believe that, but can you give me the evidence for that? Because that's often something that would be asked of me by people, and I don't have that evidence.
It's a biological fact that when a sperm fertilizes an egg, what results is a living thing. Now, you can argue whether it's viable, but you can't argue that it's living. There's clear scientific definition between what is a living being and what is not a living being. So biologically and scientifically, if you go to a biological textbook and say, what is the definition of a living being, that will be it. And so it's interesting that the abortion debate, for example, has shifted over the last 20 years quite radically, which was, oh, it's just a clump of cells. Yeah, well, so are you. You're just a clump of cells, if you want to look at it. But the modern abortion debate isn't denying it, saying, yeah, it's a human, but I still have a right to kill it if I want to. That is, most abortion proponents today will not deny the biological realities. They will just argue that they're justified in being able to kill it.
Right choice.
but you cannot argue it from a scientific principle, realistically. You can't even argue that it's human, because if you test it, you'll know it's not an ape, it's not a dolphin, it's not a toad. It is human, and it is alive. So your only argument really is viability or utility. So some people say it doesn't yet have a consciousness, so you can kill it. Well, what about somebody in a coma? And then it's a different discussion. But you cannot argue that it's just a clump of cells. It is a living organism, and it is a human living organism.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, any other comments, any other questions? Heads are spinning. I thought,
firstly, Mike, thanks for your time this evening. I don't necessarily have a question, but maybe let me just rumble some thoughts and see if you have any feedback. Firstly, it was nice to get your comment about science in general, and particularly in the social sciences, and today what passes off for science and really isn't. I think it's important for us to be able to critique the foundations of what is going on, particularly in the social sciences. I remember in my university days, one of the things we emphasized with the sciences is in social sciences, we didn't have any laws as you would have the law of physics or chemistry or biology, because it was clear in our minds that you cannot have laws in the social sciences, but basically refer to them as assumptions. And so even when studies are done, we don't look for cause and effect, but are essentially looking for a correlation between things. And it's interesting how, as you have said today, so many studies will be done and people immediately begin to say, well, X causes Y, when perhaps what they should actually be saying is that we see a correlation and not necessarily a causation. And even the causation itself could be spurious, depending on how you look at your data. But I also wanted to just get your thoughts on, the foundations of science. When you began with, you had Christian scientists and you also have atheists who are scientists. I find the presuppositional argument here, I tend to find it very effective because, the presuppositionists will argue that the Christian scientists actually has a basis to go and do science, whereas the atheist does not, because he's not able to answer the foundational question about the uniformity of nature. For you to do science, you would expect that, the future will be like the past. Scientific laws of biology, chemistry, and physics will continue to hold. But if your view is that the world came into being by an accident, you don't have a foundational basis to believe why that should continue to be. Because your starting point doesn't give you that. You have no reason to believe that we won't have another Big Bang tomorrow, in that sense. Whereas for the Christian, we believe that it is God who created, and it is God who established the physical laws that we have in place. And on that basis, we expect that tomorrow will be like yesterday, because God has created and has set up that law, and therefore we have a basis to therefore go and do science. But from what you've said also about, dishonesty taking place in the sciences and so on and so forth, I also get the sense that to do science, you also need the things such as logic to hold, you need truth to hold, you need integrity, and so on and so forth. And again, the atheist is not able to account for these things. He's not able to account for truth. He's not able to account for logic. For example, simple law of non-contradiction. You don't expect something to be and not to be. And if you're going to do science, you therefore expect that logic should hold. but I'm not able to account for that. Whereas for a Christian who is doing science, you are able to account for that. So I in my mind, I find that the presuppositional argument with regard to why we're able to do science, or why science is not in contradiction with Christianity, is a strong argument. And I don't know whether you have any comments on that, or how you see that.
I think, obviously atheists would argue against that and say, no, there's reasons. But to be honest, the mainstream scientific hypotheses for the beginning of the universe and the creation of the universe are subject to contradictions, which they try and hide. So I wouldn't go quite as far as you've said necessarily, but I would say this. In the universe, there are laws, and the existence of laws suggests the existence of a lawgiver. And that, for me, would be a starting point of discussion. And if we start to question every reality and every truth, actually, the philosopher René Descartes did that. He said, how do I know that you're not an illusion? How do I know you're real? How do I know anything's real? How do I know I'm real? And he started to question if anything actually existed. And his conclusion at the end was the well-known phrase that is used, I think, therefore I am. He said, the fact that I can ask these questions proves my existence. But it's an interesting philosophical question that if I don't know anything to be true, then maybe even this Zoom conversation is only a figment of my imagination. We've got to start, if we're not going to disappear into irrelevance, whether it would be with an atheist, a Christian, a Muslim, or a Hindu, we've got to start off with, guys, there's got to be some truths that we accept. So what is true? What is provable? What can we agree on to be true? And that can be a departure point. And for me, the fact that it's true that the law has that the universe has laws, the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, all of these things, it tells me that the universe has a lawgiver and that it works like a manufactured object because it is a created thing with an intelligent design behind it. And again, none of these discussions are ever going to get people saved, but they can open the doorway for people to open their hearts to receiving the Lord and getting saved.
Good. Thanks, Mike. Any other comments, guys? You're welcome to continue. If you not want to ask here, continue asking questions. I mean, obviously, I'm in constant contact with Mike, and or you can just pop the question to me or to whoever you know in Gospel Central Church. Anything else?
I have a comment.
Yeah,
yeah, I just felt it was very important what you said, Mike, about how we must make sure not to. We must make sure that to remember that Christianity doesn't oppose science, but rather they complement them, and that's often something that that's often one massive misconception that happens. Like, we are just those superstitious people who don't believe in gravity and whatnot, but rather it's the ultimate science that proves Christianity. And I guess it then links up to your second point about how we must always make sure we test the science of our faith. And I felt that was really important. And also, I also have noticed a few times, as you said, how these headlines, these article headlines may be completely blown out of proportion. And because usually there'll be something really eye-catching, you'll click on it, and then as you read through it, you realize it's not what it seems. So I just felt like it was very useful to hear that from you.
I've heard Christians say, I don't care what the science says, I believe. And that does make us sound stupid. I would rather say, that's interesting. I would like to look at the science of that. And then when you delve in, you realize 99% of the time, it doesn't say what people think it says. But one of the things I appreciate about the answers in Genesis, guys, and you know, I'm not saying you have to agree with everything they say, but they take a scientific approach and they say, this is our answer to this question. If it's disproven, we'll have to go away and give a different answer. They're not so dogmatic to say, we believe this and we'll never change our minds. And one of the hallmarks actually of intellectual integrity is the ability to say, I was wrong on that, I need to change. But increasingly, in certain areas, science is losing its scientific integrity because it will refuse to admit when it's wrong. And it will either just cover it up or whatever. So, for example, I can pretty much guarantee in school textbooks in Zambia today, there will be content on it on evolution and the development of human beings that has been disproven many years ago, but it's still being published and used today. One of which is, and some of you might have come across this in your own school days, pictures of the different gestational periods of a baby and now in different stages. It looks like different animals that we've kind of evolved from. And that's been proven to be an absolute hoax. It was made up, it was rubbish, it's nonsense, but you'll still find it in textbooks today. So-called scientific books, which will not accept and change where they've been proven to be wrong. And so as Christians, if we can say, this is my explanation, but if my explanation is no longer scientifically valid, I'll have to come up with a new scientific explanation. But don't say I don't care about science, I don't care what science says. We do care what science says, because if what we believe is true, science can never disprove it. I want to make a controversial statement that some people don't like me making. But I said this: if scientists one day produced a body that they could prove beyond any doubt was the body of Jesus of Nazareth, I would stop being a Christian. Because there would be absolute proof that he didn't rise from the dead. I can say that knowing deep down in my heart that they never can do that because he did rise from the dead. So science can never disprove my belief. But if science could disprove my belief, and I'm saying absolutely prove it, not a scientific claim, my belief is not contrary to truth. It is not contrary to reason. It's not contrary to the scientific method. My faith takes me where science can't. It's beyond science, but it's not contrary to. And so we as believers need to portray ourselves to the world, not justifying ourselves, not getting into meaningless debates, but as people who are reasonable, thinking people who have truth on our side. And if we genuinely believe that truth is on our side, we never have to be afraid of real science.
I think it's excellent, Mike. Guys, unless you have a very pressing question, we've arrived at the end of our time, so I think it's 8:30 and we want to honor your time. But if there's a pressing question, you're welcome to ask it. Reminding you that next week, Mike is talking about various alternative religions. I think I asked him to touch a little bit on, on other religions, and I mentioned to him some of the more prevailing alternative religions in Zambia, SDA, Jehovah's Witness, and Roman Catholics, more or less. So I'm sure he's going to probably touch on those, but we'll work it out. Check out our communications in the next week as we figure it out exactly what he's going to focus on, but that's what we're thinking of at this stage. As I say, if you have other questions, please ask. And then another thing I just want to quickly say, and it's a topic that's come up when I have preached a few times in the past, and it's a topic that is now, Mike referred to it quite a bit now, and it's the whole thing of social justice and Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. And I want to encourage you to, if you want clarity in terms of what we believe as a church, as elders, please contact me. Sometimes when we refer to a specific topic, we don't always have the ability in the context of a specific talk to unpack everything and what the implications of what we're saying and what we're not saying. So I want to really encourage you, if not that I am defending anything that was said, but that please contact me and that I would clarify it for you. And I think in one of my messages a few weeks ago, I made a throwaway comment about the Black Lives Matter movement, not Black Lives Matter, as a statement. And somebody then asked me and said, well, do you mean that you don't believe in Black Lives Matter? And so I just need to, Mike spoke about social justice, and I think he mentioned something like that. Gospel Central Church are against racism. Gospel Central Church believe that Black Lives Matters, that all are made in the image of God. But the Black Lives Matter movement is completely opposite of a biblical worldview, and it's something that we will never as a church subscribe to, never ever support in almost all its tenets. So that's so that you're just clear on that. And also know that I'm busy preparing a message that I'm probably going to preach in about 7-8 weeks on biblical justice and the importance that we as followers of Jesus are called to righteousness and justice, and I will go into much more details. So yeah, I just want to leave it at that. And I think Mike mentioned some incredible great stuff this evening, but I didn't want you to go away hearing what he didn't say. And so you're welcome to contact me. And I want to thank you guys for coming this evening. Thank you for joining us. And I trust that this has really been a good challenge to you, and it's made you rethink some of your worldviews. Maybe as we end our time together, can I ask that maybe let me see. Kavui, would you mind praying for us as we come with our time? I hope your internet's good enough that you can do it. So if you're not hearing me, then I'll ask somebody else. Kavui, would you mind praying for us?
Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the time we've had together. We thank you for all that we've been able to learn. Father, we pray that you help us to be bold as we share our faith. May we not be intimidated, knowing that all knowledge comes from you, and may we always seek your face. Even as we share what we've learned with others, may we do it with a heart of love so that people can come to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior. We thank you for Mike and the time he spent with us. We ask that you will be with us this evening. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.